broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round. And you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. All we need is hope, and for that we have each other, and for that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, so we will rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again. And we'll rise up, I like the waves. We'll rise up, in spite of the ache. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again.
This is for the girls that don't need no makeup when they wake up. For the ones who rockin' lace fronts, you know, I ain't gon' say nothing. Hashtag me you're single. You fresh off the breakup. For the introverts, no, we don't gotta say much. If you feel free, then you should lift your hand. Real love, less friends. So many things in this world I don't understand. I won't judge who you love or your brown skin.
People get liberated. Get have to aim to please or be a certain way. Don't aspire to be what you see in the magazines. There's only one you and one me. If you feel free, then you should lift your hands. Wanna shake it, baby, like I know you can. So many things in this world I don't understand. I won't judge who you love or your brown skin. People get liberated. Get up on your feet if you got the feeling. Hey. Get up on your feet. Say, people get liberated. Get up on your feet if you got the feeling. Hey. Get up on your feet. People get
I was
liberated.
young, I was old. What you reap is what you sow. Life ain't always sunny, don't get caught up in the glow. And I don't know it all, but I see as I grow. Can't take the pain away, cause it's in my soul.
If you feel free, then you should lift your hands. Wanna shake it, baby, like I know you can. So many things in this world I don't understand. I won't judge who you love or your brown skin. People get liberated. Hey. Get up on your feet if you got the feeling. You can be free. Get up on your feet. Say, people get liberated. Get up on your feet if you got the feeling. You ain't gotta worry no more.
Get up on
Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. It is so good to see all of you. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Veronica Watson. I am one of the facilitators for this evening, and we're going to get started. It is fantastic to see you all here. We may have a few other people who are joining us as we go along, but we're going to go ahead and kick this off. So I want to remind everyone that we are recording this session for this evening, and I'll tell you a little bit about why we're doing that in particular and here in just a couple of seconds. But we are so excited to be here with you this evening and have our first panel in our series launching tonight. This has been 4 months in the making, and we're really hoping that we're going to have quite an exciting lineup for you. We hope that you come back and see some other panels and participate in some other town halls. But 4 months in the making, and here we are tonight launching Let Me Read You Your Rights, a virtual community dialogue. All of our sessions for the next few weeks are going to be focused on policing, criminal justice, and social justice, the intersections of those things, and thinking about how race impacts them all. And we have a fantastic panel that's going to get started tonight. So, Rachel, if you could advance us, please. I want to introduce our facilitation team. So, I'm Dr. Veronica Watson. I am the convener of the Frederick Douglass Institute and a professor of English at IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, for those of you who may be outside of our state. And I want to also just really acknowledge and appreciate my facilitation team who are on the call with me tonight. And this is the team who has helped really to get our students trained and all of the work that we've done along the way to get to this point. These are the folks who've made it happen, and I couldn't have done it without them. So Professor Rachel DeSoto Jackson, who is an associate professor in our theater department here, Maisha Carter, who is in our doctoral program in administration and leadership studies, and Nedrick Patrick, who is a graduate student, doctoral candidate in graduate studies in literature and criticism, which by chance, is also the program that I'm the program head for. So I know Nedrick in a couple of different places and ways. So let's go ahead and advance. So tonight we are writing a new history, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes giving you a bit of background about how we got here. The Frederick Douglass Institute is a consortium of higher education professionals that exist across the 14 universities in Pennsylvania state system of higher education. We've been here in the PASHI for 22 years now, doing good work with students and helping to move forward a mission in our system that has to do with supporting first generation low income and students of color. And we do that through a lot of high impact educational opportunities that we make available to those particular student groups. Our programs are always open to anyone in the system, but we make sure that we're doing the outreach to try to get some of those other students involved who may not always self-identify and sort of volunteer for those opportunities. Of course, when the pandemic hit, all of our universities had to make a pivot, and so did the Frederick Douglass Institute. And so we designed this year as a year of virtual engagement out of necessity and out of caution, wanting to keep people safe. But it has produced a couple of really exciting opportunities that I don't know that we would have kind of pursued had we not been in this space. So how's that for a silver lining? Um, we are partnering with the 400 Years of African American National History Commission in delivering a program, the series of events that we are participating in tonight, because the National Alliance of Faith and Justice has a national mentoring program that's called Pen or Pencils, National Mentoring. It exists across our country, mostly in large cities across our country, mostly serving students of color and at-risk students. And of course, pandemic, those mentoring sites also had to pivot. And for all of us who were used to having most of our engagement be face-to-face with students and interacting and going on trips with them and things like that, this has been a particularly challenging kind of shift. And for the pen or pencil sites, we really, those sites were really struggling to keep up some of the momentum in the work that they were doing with young people. So the 400-Year Commission committed some resources and time to advancing and supporting the mission of the mentoring program, Pen or Pencil, and that's where we come on board. So the reason that this session is being recorded this evening is because these recordings are going to become part of a virtual database, or library, if you will, that Pen or Pencil sites across the country can download and access and use in their home institutions and sites, which is really exciting for us. So that means that you being here tonight is not only your own learning and your own engagement with our wonderful panelists for the evening, but it's also creating materials that can be used with young people across the country who are working with adults and trying to advance their education and, you know, be good citizens and do all the things that mentoring can do. And so we're really excited to be providing this level of support for that Pen or Pencil experience. All right, so I just want to sort of thank you again for joining us and learning with us and supporting the work of Pen or Pencil and the National Alliance of Faith and Justice. And with that, we're gonna turn this forward and I will give this to Rachel to kind of tell you a little about the structure of our evening.
All right, thank you so much, Veronica. So excited to be here this evening with all of you. So just a quick sense of what our time is going to look like together in this virtual space. So we're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes with each of our three incredible panelists. And as you're listening to each panelist, we're going to invite you to use the chat to record any questions that you might have. And we're going to capture those from the chat and put them into a live document. So at the very end of our panelists speaking, we'll open that document up and we'll have many wonderful questions that will be able to kickstart a little bit of our question and answer at the end. We're not going to be able to answer all of the questions, but we will be able to save this document and we'll be able to use that for future engagement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Nedrick to introduce our fabulous panelists. Oh, Nedrick, I don't know if we can hear you here.
Hello, everyone.
There you are.
So our panelists for tonight. First on the roster, we have Gata Mokishi, who is a community advocate in the Pittsburgh community, focusing on school policing reform. She brings over 7 years of experience in advocating for inclusive and quality education. In 2019, she helped to develop the ACLU's report, Police in Pennsylvania Schools, What Education Leaders Need to Know. Without any further ado, Ms. Gata Mokoshi.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to share my screen right now. All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be doing a presentation, Police in Schools, a Social Justice Issue, who we are. So I will be introducing the first part, Gata Mokushi, Community Advocate with the ACLU. Then you will hear from Dr. Claire Cohen and then Christopher Thyberg. So before I begin, I wanted to start with a quote from Dr. Bettina Love, We Want to Do More Than Survive, an abolitionist's theory. So to even begin to attack, our destructive and punitive educational system, pedagogies that promote social justice must help educators understand and recognize America and its schools as spaces of whiteness, white rage, and white supremacy, all of which function to terrorize students of color. So to get started, I want to look at the current reality, the data and the policies that currently exist in Pennsylvania. So police officers have become more ingrained in the fabric of education. Over the past 2 decades, the number of school-based police officers in the United States and their roles have expanded. And with this increasing presence has come an increase in student arrests and referrals to law enforcement. And a referral is any time that a police officer is called or reported to police, regardless of the case's outcome. So when we take into consideration the reason that some people will say that we need police, school shootings often come up. Now, these are quite rare. In fact, they account for less than 2% of all school-related homicides, but they have also occurred at schools with and without armed law enforcement, where sometimes they have intervened, but in most situations, for example, Columbine and Parkland, they have not. And in fact, in Parkland, the shooting brought about an interesting point to consider in the case of the police officer who didn't intervene. And in fact, the court ruled that he was not required to intervene, stating neither the Constitution nor state law impose a general duty upon police officers to protect individual persons from harm, even when they know that harm will occur. So if our goal is to hire police officers who will be martyrs, who will intervene, even though again, there's no guarantee that they will, then the type of people who are going to be attracted to that job are going to be highly militarized, always looking for threats, and are not the type of people that we want interacting with our students. Additionally, there isn't any conclusive evidence that school police on campus reduce crime among students. A 2016 study found that schools with police officers have higher rates of exclusionary discipline, such as out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and arrests. And evidence has shown us that such a presence can mean an increased rate of student arrests for minor offenses, such as disorderly conduct or simple assault. And importantly, it's youth of color that are considered more likely than white youth to experience these harms. So one thing that we can't neglect to mention is implicit bias, and this is often left out of the conversation when we talk about reforms. Implicit bias plays a role in school discipline when students of color are seen as threatening and are disproportionately punished and arrested. And despite all good intentions, officers often make school climates less inclusive. They reduce trust, which undermines effective behavior management, and student misbehavior, including criminal behavior, is less likely in schools that have inclusive social climates. And Dr. Cohen will talk a little bit more about this, but inclusive social climates are schools where students feel valued, respected, listened to, and part of the community. So the racial disproportionality in suspensions and arrests cannot be explained in differences in socioeconomic status or differential rates of misbehavior. Evidence doesn't show us that Black or brown kids misbehave more, but it does show us there are more severe punishments for less serious or subjective infractions. So white students are often disciplined for very clear, unambiguous violations, smoking, drugs, while Black and brown students are disciplined for offenses that are vague or ambiguous, insubordination, disorderly conduct. So putting this into context, when we look at Pennsylvania, we can see that according to the 2015-2016 data, Pennsylvania had the third highest rate in the nation, second for Black students and third for students with disabilities. Digging down a little bit to who is most likely to be arrested, and this is not just in Pennsylvania, this is nationwide. The most likely student to be arrested is a Black boy with a disability. However, the one thing I want to highlight is that Black girls are disproportionately arrested and suspended when compared to white girls. And that's something that we tend to overlook because they rank a little bit lower than Black boys in terms of the number of arrests and suspensions. So looking at Pittsburgh specifically, Pittsburgh is the second largest school district in Pennsylvania, and I compared it with Philadelphia, which is the largest. And Philadelphia is about 6 times the size of Pittsburgh. Yet in Pittsburgh, we arrest students at about 8 times the rate. So 37% of those students arrested were Black girls, 44% of the students arrested were Black boys. So over 80% of students arrested are Black students. 35% of students arrested had a disability, even though students with a disability account for less than 20% of the student population. And again, not surprisingly, the most common charge listed for arrest was disorderly conduct. And in reviewing arrests across actually the city, what I found was that disorderly conduct was pretty much added to every single arrest of of all Black youth, regardless of what the original charge was. Disorderly conduct was just added on, so that when they get to court, even if it's negotiated down, disorderly conduct is still what they end up being charged with. So moving on to summary citations, which I think is something that a lot of people might not be familiar with. They're very similar to a traffic ticket. So they're issued for very minor infractions, usually things that we would consider typical youth behavior. Excessive noise, obscene gestures or language, sometimes even for vaping. And although receiving a ticket seems like a minor issue, they're actually harmful and can have long-term consequences for youth. For starters, they are adult criminal offenses. There is no distinction between juveniles or adults when it comes to citations as there are in arrests. And with a citation, youth are required to appear before a magistrate. They're not provided legal counsel, so they may not even understand what their rights are. If for some reason the student fails to appear, maybe they don't consider it serious, they just don't think that they need to show up, that hearing can be conducted without their presence. And again, they could appeal this within 30 days, but since they aren't provided with a lawyer, they may not know that they can or even how. So most summary citations typically result in fines. These could be several $100s. And this is how these minor infractions escalate. So if youth are unable to pay these, then they are charged separately what's called a failure to comply charge and referred to juvenile justice. And in fact, failure to comply accounts for 1/3 of all referrals in this county. So a child could get a citation for being too loud, for cussing, but because they're unable to pay the fine related to that citation, they're now charged with a failure to comply. So essentially punishing poverty. The other thing is that summary convictions are not automatically expunged. And a record of the summary offense actually cannot be expunged until 6 months after turning 18, and only if all conditions have been met. So if, like many youth at 17 or 18, they want to apply for a job, college, or military application, they are asked if they've ever been convicted of a crime, they must say yes. So to put this in context, when I looked at summary citations in Pennsylvania, the minimum age you can be arrested is 10. There is no minimum age for summary citations. So there, in one case, there was a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old who were clearly siblings who were fighting, and they were both issued a summary citation. So it should not be controversial in light of these facts to say that racial disproportionality does not develop by accident or coincidence. It is at least partially the result of institutionalized racism and implicit or explicit biases. So looking forward, what needs to change? So to start, we need to ensure that all school policies and practices are structured to prevent the criminalization of Black and Brown youth. So all policies must be reviewed with this goal in mind. What does this look like? So we could look at the school's code of conduct, look for language that is vague, subjective, and demand that your school board and school district ensure that the language is clear, remove subjective language. And this is particularly important because normative baselines where whiteness is considered the racial norm then tend to punish Black and Brown youth. So seemingly neutral decision making and behavioral evaluation criteria are not in fact race neutral. And when you consider that 80% of all school teachers are white, it is easy to see why there is racial disproportionality in school discipline, especially as it pertains to offenses like defiance or disrespect, because these categories are inherently vague and normative. Another thing school districts can do is to rewrite their memorandum of understanding between their district and local police. So in Pennsylvania, every school district in the state is required to have a memorandum of understanding with local law enforcement. So this serves as a guideline. And what districts can do is to ensure that both parties have a shared understanding of their roles and responsibilities in maintaining safe schools. And schools can limit the involvement of local law enforcement. They can set guidelines to protect students and their privacy. Districts have a responsibility to support student learning and to minimize contact between students and police. They need to clearly delineate for schools when and when not to call police, and to specify the limited role of police when they are called. So school safety and policing. Districts that value Black youth don't have metal detectors, they don't have constant surveillance. If you look at school districts in the suburbs that are predominantly white, most don't have these. Their students are not under constant surveillance. I think Dr. Cohen will touch a little bit about this as well. But there are other alternatives to this. So school districts can push for police-free schools. They can ask for more supports. One thing that I do want to put out there is that even as we're pushing for police out of our schools, we shouldn't put any more reliance on security guards. One thing that we have seen is that particularly for young girls and particularly for girls of color, have experienced sexual harassment by security guards who represent authority figures in their lives. So we can't consider that security guards instead of police are a safer alternative. And while districts reconsider safety options and look at the role of police and security guards, I would urge them, for one, to look at the roles that they have in their district to see how many security guards and police officers they have, and do the number of police officers and security guards outnumber the number of counselors and social workers, as that says a lot about what a district values. And with that, I have resources here. I will turn it over to Dr. Cohen.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about trauma because our society is a society in which there's a lot of trauma to children. We're not a child-friendly society. We're a society that for some reason traumatizes a good number of children. So the CDC and SAMHSA, that's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, have every year carried out surveys looking at trauma in what the incidence and prevalence of trauma is in American society. And based on looking at these surveys over a 10-year period, we're pretty sure that about 70% of adults have had at least one traumatic incident in their lives. Now, what's a traumatic incident? A traumatic incident is an incident where a person perceives either their life or their bodily integrity to be in danger, or the life or bodily integrity of someone they love or people around them. In other words, you're feeling like you could lose your life because of what's happening, or that you could be seriously injured, or that someone you love could lose their life or be seriously injured, or people around you. So for example, being in the middle of a tornado, okay, being in the middle of a mass shooting, watching your mother being seriously beaten by someone, being brutalized by the police. These are all examples of traumatic events. So 70%, if you think about it, is a lot. Now, of those adults that have had at least one traumatic incident, and we're not talking about people that have had more than one, 60% of them experienced their traumatic incident as a child or adolescent. And when you look at children and adolescents, the correlate is almost half of all children and adolescents in the United States, near close to 35 million, have had at least one traumatic incident occur in their lives. We know now that trauma doesn't just affect the psyche. It isn't a minor thing, especially in children. In children, trauma causes major fundamental changes in the brain, in the endocrine system, in the autonomic nervous system, in the heart. We can go on and on. In the brain, there's an area called the amygdala, which helps us modulate emotional responses and respond to severe experiences. That gets damaged. The hippocampus, which plays a major role in learning and memory, that gets damaged. So trauma has a very profound impact. Children who have experienced trauma are at increased risk, even if they weren't genetically before, are at increased risk for growing up to have depression, to having as well PTSD, anxiety, and behavioral problems. They're at risk for failing both in school and having more problems within interpersonal relationships and in functioning on the job. But they're also at higher risk of having hypertension, having diabetes, having all kinds of physical ailments. Their physical health actually deteriorates. So we realize now that trauma is a serious problem, and that half of the children in our country have at least one traumatic event, and somewhere between 20 and 40% of children, depending on what study you look at, has more than one traumatic event, is a serious problem for our society. And of course, children of color and poor children are overrepresented, are disproportionately affected by trauma. Now, when you look at children, actually about 2/3 of trauma occurs in the home. It's due to sexual, physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, and severe neglect. But the other 1/3 of trauma occurs outside of home, in the streets and in the schools. In the streets, the two main sources of trauma are violence between people in the neighborhoods and police brutality, especially for people of color. In schools, the sources of trauma, a major source of trauma, once again, is police and guards in schools. So, and another important fact that people need to think of in terms of trauma, once you've had one trauma, not everybody who's experienced a traumatic event is damaged by it. A significant proportion are, but once you've had one trauma, that increases the risk that you will be severely damaged if you have another trauma. So experiencing one trauma makes one even more vulnerable if one has another trauma. And we can go to the next slide. Now, there's been a lot of research on police and school, because since these shootings, we know that people have been claiming this is a way to keep people safe in schools and people will feel safer in schools. So there have been a number of studies looking at the impact of having police in schools and how people have felt about it. So a number of interesting things that have come out. So number one, and this isn't in the slide, but I need to get a slide to say this because I like to say this. When you look at who feels safe with police in schools, it's the adults, it's the staff. That's who feels safe with police in schools. They definitely feel better. But when you look at student bodies, children of color, particularly Black children, the majority of Black children actually feel less safe with police in schools, and a significant proportion of Latinx and white children, and even Asian children, feel less safe with police in schools. Children who have been traumatized by police are even made more unsafe by having their presence there. Now, there have been a couple of studies looking at police in schools, what they view as the threats and who they're protecting. And there was an interesting study in Chicago that looked at urban schools in the Chicago area, that looked at urban schools versus schools that are predominantly white, and asked police what were the threats that they needed to protect people from. And this, very alarmingly, and people need to realize this, when police were in predominantly white schools, they saw the threats as outside the schools and the students as the one to be protected. But in schools that were predominantly Black and in urban schools, police viewed the threats as the students themselves. And that's very important for people to realize. So they're coming into a school, they're coming into an environment where you have a significant number of children who have been traumatized already, who need to be protected, who need to be made to feel more safe. And these police are coming into the school and they're viewing those same kids as the threat. And you know that when police view somebody as a threat, we all know how police respond. So next slide. Now, when we look at the impact of policing in school, it really fits in very nicely with the impact of trauma on kids. Okay, so when you look at the impact of trauma on schools, it affects developmental outcomes, it affects academic achievements, and as I said earlier, it causes a decrease in functioning both in school and jobs later on in life. And children who have been traumatized have an increase in rates of behavior problems as well as psychiatric problems. Well, when you put police in the schools, what studies have shown is that it doesn't improve the safety and it doesn't improve the functioning or the atmosphere of the school. Rather, you have more problems with developmental outcomes, you have lower academic achievement, you have increased dropout rates, and you have increased rates of behaviors. It seems contradictory, but you actually have increased rates of behavior. And you have a higher rate of what's called exclusionary discipline or suspension and expulsion. And it's pretty clear it's pretty clear that suspension and expulsion does not change a child's behavior. If anything, it causes children to be worse. I like to use examples from my own practice. My favorite was a young girl who went to school, stuck up her third finger, got suspended, went out and stole a car. Came back to school. Now she knew just what to do to get out of school. Stick up your third finger. That's getting her suspended. Goes out, engages in more conduct disordered or delinquent behavior, and eventually ended up arrested and in the juvenile justice system. So this kind of punitive approach does not improve childhood behavior or the atmosphere of the schools. One of the things that I want to point out for people is that suspensions and expulsions have never worked in changing child behavior. It's something for adults, actually. It's to get problematic children that we can't handle out of our hair. It's not really something that really there's no study that shows that suspensions and expulsions makes an improvement in child behavior. The other troubling problem is that a lot of behavior that when there's not police in schools are handled in much more developmentally appropriate ways and sometimes therapeutic ways. When police come into the school, even if the police is not called, it changes the atmosphere, and the level of punitiveness and viewing behavior as something delinquent to be punished rather than a red flag of problems to be addressed goes up. So one of the things, the police, it's not just the police, what the police do, it's how it affects the whole atmosphere. So we get children, little boys fight, and children who are stressed, who are being abused, who are being at home and so on, what do? They fight, or they sexually act out when they go to school. So what happens to those kids when the police are there? People immediately think, call the police, instead of, is there a problem with this kid? Does this kid need some help? Does this kid need to be referred for some therapeutic intervention or whatnot? So the kid who's already being traumatized then has a response that compounds the trauma and causes a rapid deterioration in functioning rather than helping the kid function. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I like to show this little video because I think this person says very eloquently what we need to be looking at when we see kids in school having behavioral disturbance and how we need to approach it. So I'll just let it play and then talk about it.
When we talk about trauma-informed schools, really what we are describing is the awareness that educators, administrators, and other school personnel have of the impact of trauma on students in terms of behavior, in terms of relationships, in terms of ability to regulate internal states and how that manifests in the classroom. Ultimately, trauma-informed schools understand and recognize that children's behavior is a developmental response to past experience, so that instead of wondering what's wrong with a child or immediately beginning to label, we start to ask the question, what might have happened that explains this child's behavior? And all of a sudden, when we do that, understanding can manifest, and we can begin to address the underlying needs that the child may have. When we think about components of a trauma-informed school, it's important and I think very helpful to look at sort of a multi-tiered approach. So what's happening universally on the school campus? What kinds of positive behavior intervention and supports are in place to support all students and support a healthy, safe, and compassionate school climate? What kinds of supports are in place in terms of teaching social emotional learning? And how do we begin to recognize that in a trauma-informed school environment, all children are supported regardless of trauma history? Often we may not know who of the student body has been exposed, but certainly if we're providing a safe and sane and secure and caring climate, it will ultimately support all students. As we move up into the secondary tier or that selective level, what we begin to see are small groups that can effectively address some of the symptoms of child trauma, as well as some disciplinary policies through dean's offices, et cetera, that begin to take into account some of the child's past experience and move beyond simply a disciplinary or punitive standpoint. Certainly, programs such as restorative justice can make a big difference. And then at the indicated level or the tertiary level of care, how do we begin to either provide those mental health services through district initiatives or partner with outside agencies to be able to provide the one-on-one mental health services necessary to support students who have been exposed to trauma and are presenting with significant symptomatology?
Okay. So I want to just give an example of what he's talking about. So many children who have witnessed or been victimized by violence, whether it's in the home or by a police brutality, become hypervigilant. Hypervigilant means you're ready to protect yourself. You're ready to do whatever it takes and you're ready to fight back. So you have a child like that, they come to school, somebody touches them. It could be a teacher just trying to put their hand on their shoulder, or it could be a peer. And the kid turns around ready to fight and get your hands off of me. And immediately the kid's labeled as belligerent and oppositional and ready to fight and delinquent and all of this. And that kind of kid ends up very quickly, if they don't end up in a fight with peers, they end up very quickly. Sometimes they end up being accused of assaulting the teacher. You take a kid like that, you call the police now come and they're ready to manhandle the kid. And this is a kid who's already in a stance of needing to protect him or herself. So what we end up with a kid who was traumatized by violence, who's taught that the adults, the important adults in his or her life, including school, are just going to continue to perpetuate that violence and becomes more violent, becomes a hyper-vigilant kid can't learn in school because they're more focused on protecting themselves. They start struggling, they fail, they're viewed as oppositional, they're viewed as disruptive, and you get this vicious cycle and you end up with a kid finally in the school to prison pipeline. Other kids see this kid manhandled or treated in the way they are. And some other kids are actually traumatized by watching what happens to that kid. So what are some of the things that we need to do? Some of the things that there's increasing evidence are helpful for kids, for healing kids who are traumatized and for keeping other kids from being traumatized. So one is having an approach that has more nurses, more social workers, more psychologists, more counselors in the school. And this is the recommended ratios in Pennsylvania schools and what's real. And as you can see, we fall far short because oftentimes what needs to happen with a kid first, as the video says, we need to be asking what is this kid's life experience that could be leading them to act this way, rather than what's wrong with this bad kid, why, that kind of thing. We need to be, and we need a body of people that have some experiences, and all these people do have some of these experiences. Of course, it helps if the counselors or psychologists or nurses or social workers are also people of color, because it cuts down on it, doesn't get rid of, but it cuts down on some of those biases. Other things that have been shown to be helpful for children are restorative practices programs, meditation and yoga. There were 2 schools in the Baltimore area. They were grammar schools and grammar and elementary school, which implemented a meditation program for kids for the school-wide when the kids would come in. Their level of absenteeism dropped dramatically. Kids were flocking to come to schools. I used to, for a while, back in the 90s, I worked at an alternative school called Pay School. We did a lot of meditation and yoga. And I can tell you that these things help kids learn to regulate their behaviors. They help them learn to focus and center. They help them learn to calm themselves. So kids who are stressed really take to these things, and they learn a lot of self-regulatory skills. The behavior, the level of behavior in general tends to decrease. And you're teaching kids something that helps them heal rather than brutalizing and re-traumatizing. Recess. Remember recess? If you look at some studies in Europe, Finland, Denmark, and so on, recess is very important for children, especially young children. They need to jump and run and play and get out excess energy. There have been studies that show that children in schools where there's at least two or three recess, at least 2 periods of recess, substantial a day, actually perform better academically. Music and arts, once again. And what has happened in our schools? We've cut out music and arts. But for many children and many adolescents, music and arts can become healthy, nonviolent, healing ways of processing stress, processing trauma, and learning how to turn those experiences to creative interests rather than disruptive and behavioral disturbances. So all of these things are things we know that are helpful for kids, and yet our schools have cut back on music and arts. They've cut back on recess. Many schools don't have things like meditation and yoga for children. And I know that I had some children in the Pittsburgh public school system, even though their schools talked about doing restorative practices, they were never really implemented. They were never really implemented in a way that could help children learn how to deal with conflict and how to resolve differences and disputes. So if you get anything out of this talk, if we want to have child-friendly schools that promote children learning, that help children feeling safe, we need to look at what's in the best interest of children. And what's in the best interest of children isn't making adults feel safe by treating children as criminals and treating them as threats. What's in the best interest of children is promoting an environment where they learn not only book learning, but they learn how to interact with human beings. They learn how to use their creative potentials to better themselves and calm themselves and heal themselves, where they learn how to modulate their emotions, and where they just have fun. And that's what's in the best interest of children.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, Chris.
All right, so I am going to jump in at this point, and this is a portion of a presentation that I did with 2 of my colleagues over at Pitt, Deshauna Fusselware and Cecily Davis. And our presentation was entitled From Restoration to Transformation, and it's really, from our end, was considering how do we add a lens that addresses racism within school policy reform. And so I think we've really thoroughly laid out what is going on in terms of the problem as it exists. And I think there's really 2 predominant solutions, one being trauma-informed care, which was just very well described by Dr. Cohen, and another is restorative justice, which I'll discuss very briefly. But from our point of view, what we really wanted to think about was expanding and incorporating what an anti-racist lens would look like, what a lens that approaches systemic oppression would look like within these school-based interventions as we start to sort of imagine a new future. And so restorative justice, for those who aren't familiar with this, it's a non-punitive relationship-centered approach to discipline. So when we talked about sort of harsh exclusionary discipline, suspension, expulsion, this is something that focuses more on relational development, hence the restorative side, right? That you want to restore relationships and focus on even building school climate. So some schools that have implemented this have really thought about it even as a preventative measure, not just after 2 students have fought, how do you get them back together to communicate, but trying to really build relationships so that there is something to restore if something does happen. So a couple brief examples of what this can look like are things like restoration circles. And that's really creating a space for people to talk with one another, to share how they were feeling during a conflict, to find spaces for resolution. something that's also very common within this is to use peer juries and peer mediation. So using their fellow students to actually talk through what was experienced to help come to resolution, using community service as an alternative to suspension or expulsion. This was also addressed within the video about trauma-informed schools, but social emotional learning. So again, providing some of those skills, and then having staff. So this was also brought up related to trauma informed schools, but really thinking about, do you have like a full-time practitioner who's there to work with the students to provide some sort of mediation rather than going straight to the police when there's a dispute. And to be clear, restorative justice and trauma-informed care are wonderful. I really like these practices, but the point of our work was really to think about, so what are some of the questions that we need to ask, and what are some of the solutions that we need to bring into this? So if we can move to the next slide, really our question was, how do we think bigger? How do we address racism in our interventions? Because as you were hearing, there's an issue with racism as it's going on within policing, within experiences of trauma, but isn't necessarily as brought up within the actual solutions when we talk about restorative justice or trauma-informed care, these mental health services. They don't tend to incorporate that element. And so this leads me to the first question, where we're thinking about, if systemic racism is a problem, why isn't it in the solution? And so just quickly, to be, kind of clear on the terms that we're using here, systemic racism is sometimes used as this term that means that there's lots of people. So I'll use the police, since that's kind of what we're talking about, police and schools, as an example, that people will say systemic racism within policing means that many, many cops are individually racist. And that is not what systemic racism means. It means even with an individual who themselves may not actively be trying to discriminate or operate from a place of racial bias or prejudice, can still enforce racist policies and laws that disproportionately harm Black and Brown communities, right? And so 2 examples of how systemic racism can operate within policing is that police have been recorded admitting, like there have been documented cases of them sharing that they've been pressured to specifically patrol and operate in low-income inner city and predominantly Black and Brown communities to combat drug activity, despite having evidence or information that there's actual prevalence of drugs in other neighborhoods that might be better established financially, may have political connections or other things that make them sort of reticent to then go and engage in those spaces. So that's an example of systemic racism materializing, that people are just sort of pushed into their sort of roles, and it's not about their individual decision making when they're in a situation, it's about the general system and how it's set up. Another example within that would be how police accountability does or does not occur after incidents of police brutality, right? And this has been mentioned as well, but the mass shootings have justified more police in schools. And even though the likelihood of mass shootings is small, and they are more likely to occur in predominantly white and suburban schools, the majority of police are placed into inner city schools with Black and Brown students, right? So that's, again, we're seeing sort of this issue within the policies that are being created. However, a lot of the solutions that are being offered are focused on an individual's ability to kind of cope with that structural problem. So for example, teaching youth, children, students how to interact with a police officer when they are fearful for their life is an example of giving an individual the responsibility to deal with a structural problem, because the issue is still, how are police being put into neighborhoods? How are they being sort of operationalized to engage with that community, right? And then we're putting the responsibility on a kid of being better behaved in school, of not causing problems in school, of trying to avoid interactions with the police. And even having trainings for police, I think, is still somewhat, if you think about an anti-bias training, it's still somewhat feeding into that same problem. And so if we want to think about sort of the recommendation that we need to emerge from that, if we can jump to the next slide, we need to think about policy changes at the structural level, not just the individual level. And so this does not mean do not have individual supports. I absolutely encourage schools to use lots of mental health counselors, lots of social workers. I'm a social worker myself. I absolutely encourage those things. But what ends up happening often is we only look at the individual and trying to meet the individual where they're at, instead of thinking about what are the policies that are creating experiences of trauma? What are the policies that are putting children in harm's way? And trying to look at the upstream solutions to sort of the downstream problems that we're seeing in the actual behaviors or incidents that are occurring within schools. And so some examples of this can be things like where police are placed or how they're held accountable. This is a really big one as well, is, you know, kind of one step above that is thinking about school funding. In PA, we have one of the worst in the country disproportionalities between per pupil funding. So how much each student is allocated in terms of funds. There's a 33% difference between the highest funded student and the lowest funded student in the state. And a lot of this has to do with property taxes and how that gets allocated into school funding. And so if we want to think about ways to make schools a safer place, we need to think big about how do we undo elements related to property taxes. And not to get too lost in the weeds, but we know that home ownership value was dictated previously by redlining, now is being dictated by issues of gentrification, and that there are still documented cases of homes that, when owned under a Black person, are valued significantly less than the same home when owned by a white family, right? And so if we want to address issues connected to how schools are funded, we need to really see that all these things, housing and all these other issues, are interconnected. And related to that, funding social programs like access to healthcare, like addressing poverty, housing, food insecurity, that these issues are intimately connected even to these broader or more specific issues that we're thinking about related to how children are functioning in schools. And so that is one of the kind of the starting places of really thinking about how do we approach this. And I do think that it's important that we integrate sort of this anti-racist lens within those solutions. The next thing is really thinking about how we define empowerment or mental health. And so most interventions really focus on an individual person's empowerment, right? Like, how do they feel? How do they behave? And there's really not a connection to thinking about a community or a collective, a group of people. And so to give just a brief definition of critical consciousness, it's really, in simplest terms, it's thinking about how does a person connect to the historical and structural and political forces around them? How do they recognize that their experience is shared by other people, that there's oppressive, systemic, and structural forces around them? And then how do they turn that information into sort of knowledge and collective action with other people? And a lot of our interventions do not do that. It only looks at sort of the individual. And I really like this quote that I included here. It says, "When stripped of critical consciousness and social action to correct system injustices, empowerment is quickly distorted into a self-improvement discourse that instructs individuals to identify themselves rather than the surrounding social conditions as the problem to be fixed, and to then compete against each other rather than join with them." And so all that to say, is very important when we're designing interventions, when we're creating, you know, mental health supports, that we do connect political and community action and social action into the interventions that we're providing for these kids. And then the last bit I'll say about this is thinking about interventions. A lot of what's been designed within trauma-informed schools and even restorative justice has been evidence-based. There's research behind it, but it's predominantly focused on white and middle-class kids. It's not been normed for Black and Latinx kids. And that's a really big problem, because that means that we're not doing research to actually see if these things work within these communities that we want to use them. And there's also issues of how we define norms of what's healthy and what we think a child should behave like. And as was kind of discussed earlier with implicit bias, we know that Black and brown kids tend to be viewed as more aggressive, as more disobedient, and that's going to inform how our interventions are being done if we're not being thoughtful about it. And so we really want to make sure that our interventions include critical consciousness, group empowerment, taking action, being a collective rather than just seeing sort of an individual that needs to have their behaviors changed to better fit in at school. And then we need to use a strengths-based perspective that's non-pathologizing. So again, not blaming the individual, not saying what's wrong with you, but saying what happened to you, what's going on, what are the things going on in your life. And really important to that is including youth voice, giving them a meaningful space to design what is helpful in an intervention, what they want to see happen, and then including an anti-racist perspective. So having that space, again, of collective consciousness means providing a space for solidarity, understanding shared experiences, and having a historical framework, realizing that the moment that we exist in did not happen in a vacuum, that there are centuries of racist policies that have put us into this exact moment, and that those things matter and that they should be addressed and acknowledged within the work that we're doing. And so if we want to jump to the next slide, the next part of this is really thinking about who defines rules in schools. And so we know that schools tend to be sort of top down in decision making, that it really goes from policymakers to the administrators to the teachers and then to the students. And that student voice, when it does exist, tends to be more symbolic than actually practical. And so that brings us to the next recommendation, which is to really reallocate power to students and families. So to increase youth voice in the decision making. So when we think about alternatives to suspension or expulsion, or alternatives to police in schools, students should have a voice in their experiences and share what has been helpful for them, share what has not been helpful for them, and meaningfully craft decision making rather than just being given sort of this, token element of input or involvement that doesn't actually meaningfully change the school policy. And similarly, engaging the adult caregivers. And one of the big challenges to this, right, is making it accessible, making sure that parents are able to attend if they work multiple jobs, if they are not available during certain hours of the day, if they have multiple kids and need to provide home care, right? Like there's a lot of issues that a school needs to be really thoughtful of, and that we need to be intentional in how we craft spaces to make sure that all voices are heard equally. And I just want to stress with this that the effort here is collaboration over conflict. So this is not to say that we need to give all the power to students and families so that they can, be in conflict with administrators, but recognizing that it's really only when you have people meaningfully pulling their voices together that we're going to see progress. And so this brings me to my final sort of question and recommendation, which is thinking about how do we make interventions that meet the unique needs of students. And so a lot of interventions, whether they be trauma-informed care or restorative justice, really tend to be sort of monolithic, a one size fits all. But we know that people experience the world in unique ways, and that therefore they have unique needs, that trauma has impacted them differently, that their needs within school or their needs for mental health services are different. Racism, sexism, ableism, classism, homophobia, immigration status, language barrier. I could keep listing things, right? And we know that these intersections meet in meaningful ways, that it's not just sort of like adding one and one and one, and you get this number. It's knowing that someone's immigration status and their ability and their class all can intersect and create really unique experiences for them that would not be seen for other people. And so that brings us to the last recommendation, which is that when we're building our programming, when we're thinking about intervention design within schools, that they need to be intersectional, that they need to account for people's different lived life experiences, and particularly account for people. One of the things I'll highlight here is different levels of ableness, right? So dependent on how they can meaningfully interact with the services that you're providing will define whether or not your services are even useful to this person. Again, as we start to think about like research or practice that's being done, it needs to be inclusive of different student experiences, which means that our program should be flexible and adaptable and able to mold into the various needs of the students that we're trying to serve. And this is an iterative process, meaning that it's a continuous one where we assess what we're doing. Based on that assessment, you change what you're doing, you implement it, and then you assess it again, and then you change it again, and then you try it out that way. And really, I think that's the only method of really building true intersectional programming that does account for different student needs within our school systems. And so with that, I'll conclude. I think we're going to open it up into the Q&A now.
Yes, we are. Thank you so very much. Wow. Our three panelists tonight, thank you. Thank you so much. You've given us so much thought-provoking stuff to work with. I'm just ready for some questions here. So feel free to unmute yourselves. We do have some questions that have been coming in over the chat. We're going to invite you in to participate in our discussion. This is a town hall, so we want to hear from you. So maybe throw up your hand. We can't see all the pictures, but you can use your little picture in the corner of your screen there. Yes, and I see Valerie, and then we'll bounce to a question that's come in over chat. So Valerie, go ahead and get us started. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. I enjoyed listening to your speech. I just wanted to start off with that. It was very nice.
Thank
Um,
you.
I did want to point out something though. I do think that police officers can be very helpful in schools. Sometimes that can be the only interaction that they have that is good with law enforcement. So when police, especially community oriented police officers, that's a new thing that's been coming around for a while now, and is community oriented policing. And that's a whole new different type of policing. It's a very good police working ethic, and a lot of people were starting to change going towards that. I know that I'm right now a guard at a jail, and I'm personally community oriented. I've helped out inmates. I've had an inmate that's never come back, and I gave like some pretty good advice. They don't have to listen to anything I tell them because I'm or anything, but I've given good advice, and they've taken a lot of things into consideration, and they have improved. And now whenever I say walk out in Walmart and they see me and they've been thinking about doing something they shouldn't, they come over to me and they said, "Thank you for being here today, because I'm now rechecking what I'm doing and doing better for myself." And I do want to let people know that there are things that have been put in place for people who do have records coming outside of the um, prison. So if they have a misdemeanor or they have felonies, there are employers that do work with the courts to get them back onto jobs and get them back on their feet. And I want to have your thoughts based on that, because I do know that those types of systems do reduce the recidivism.
Mhm.
I also wanted to get your opinion on, you guys brought up background checks. The only time a summary offense comes up on a employer's background when they run their backgrounds is if it is a criminal citation. If it's a criminal summary offense. If it's a regular summary offense, that doesn't show up. And most of the time, the only time a traffic citation shows up on a background check is if it had injuries in it and it has citations. So like if you wrecked and you hit
Okay,
something, the only
Valerie,
time that shows up.
I'm gonna actually ask you to pause, and let's see if
Okay.
any of our panelists want to jump
All
in
right.
and offer a response there. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I have a response. So the summary citations, more what I was saying was that if asked on an application, if you have ever been convicted, then you have to say yes if you have not had if you have not expunged your summary citation. So it's more of having to answer that where you wouldn't have to if it was an adjudication. So that's the difference, because it's still considered an adult offense. There isn't a distinction. I agree with you that having programs when people are released from jail does help them, and it does with sorry, the rate. But what I will say, and this topic has come up quite a lot, even in Pittsburgh, is if you're in a school and the only person that a child trusts is that police officer or the school or the security guard, then I take that as a failure of that school to have not created a more supportive and inclusive environment for that child. And as Chris was talking about, it's not about the individual. There are very good individuals, people who go into policing to honestly help, who may not carry some of these biases, but it's the system. It's the way that we've structured some of these policies that tend to criminalize Black and Brown students and just youth in general disproportionately. I don't know if Chris wants to add anything or Claire does to this.
I wanted to add something, and that is, once again, I mean, there are a lot of good people, Valerie. I think what you do is clearly you're a very warm and caring person. But once again, I want to emphasize it is the system. And one of the problems when you look at schools, I went to a round table once where they had a police who came from a relatively well-to-do suburban school where he was the resource officer. And when he described in the roundtable what he did in school, it didn't look nothing like what police in the schools I'm aware of, the urban schools like Pittsburgh, what used to be Wilkinsburg, I'll name some other schools that predominantly Black did. I mean, he was going there and teaching courses in criminal justice. That's what he was doing. But, and that's because he didn't perceive the kids, and the system doesn't perceive the kids in those schools as the threats themselves. It perceives them as people to be protected. But too often in schools where kids are predominantly Black and brown, they are perceived as, and there have been a number of studies that have shown this, the kids themselves who are there are not perceived as someone to be protected, but as the threat. And too often you have kids who are already traumatized, and kids, and there are plenty of police officers who are good at what they do, but I can tell you as a psychiatrist, I see lots of kids, and it's not even in schools, where someone has called the police because the kid's having a mental health crisis, and the police comes and does exactly what compounds and makes it worse, because you're not mental health professionals. You're not someone who's been trained in that. So when kids are having issues related to the kind of experiences they've had in their lives, the traumatic experiences, what they need the most is someone who has some kind of expertise and training and how to deal with that kind of trauma. And police are trained in certain things, but they're definitely not trained in how, and I don't expect them to be. That's not that wasn't the job you were trained to do. We need to, when we have people who are having mental health issues, we should have people who are experts in mental health to deal with it. When we have children who are having developmental issues, we should have people who have expertise in dealing with developmental issues. And too often, especially with kids of color, it's too often it's looked at as these bad kids, and what can we do to teach them a lesson, rather than, as was said before, what's going on with this kid? What's their experience? Do they need some developmental help? Do they need some mental health interventions? What is it that they need? Do they need some food in their house at night? What is it that they need to help them function? And I think, so I will stop with that.
Okay. I am going to ask Rachel to give us another question. And Chris, if it's a question that you can land, we're going to bat that one to you first.
So we've got actually 3 outstanding questions and not enough time, but that's okay. We'll be able to continue these dialogues within our series. So the next question here. So I'm actually going to go back to an early question, because Chris, maybe you can talk about this question in relation to restorative justice. So this question was an early question talking about the idea of the stats at the intersection of race and gender, specifically thinking about students who are non-binary and transitioning. And the question was asking about how Black and BIPOC folks are really most vulnerable to violence and struggle when it comes to discipline and law enforcement. So I apologize if this is your question and I'm butchering it, but I wonder, Chris, if you might talk a little bit about how that plays into what you were sharing with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really good question and a very important one. I think, again, to give this idea of intersectionality is this idea that each person has sort of multiple identities, social identities that they have. So for myself, I am a white man. I'll start with those 2 things, right? And that those 2 things, by virtue of intersecting, create sort of a new, unique experience for me, compared to just saying like white plus man equals one experience. It's and that is true for everyone, right? So your level of ability, the languages that you speak, your immigration status, all these things shape how you interact with the world around you, right? And some of these things can create elements that make parts of navigating the world easier or parts of navigating the world more difficult, create more barriers, discrimination, etc. And absolutely, to that question, there is a lot of evidence that has shown that gender nonconforming individuals are far more likely to be victims of violence, that they are much more likely to experience homicide, abuse, violence, and that, as was being mentioned, we also know that when someone has experienced trauma, when they've experienced abuse, that intersections with people within positions of authority have the potential to create sort of compounding issues. And so something that I've seen in some of the research and work that I've done is connected to how kids that have experienced trauma tend to be less likely to listen to people in positions of authority, like a police officer, right? And so if you have someone that's experienced that level of trauma through their lived life experience, and then they have a police officer that's telling them like, hey, like, you're not allowed to be in the hall right now, you have to go. It is not unusual for a kid, and then let's again remember, right, a kid, someone that is still, like, their brain is still developing, they're still figuring a lot of sort of social dynamics out. It's not unusual for them to say, like, for them to talk back or to not listen to those instructors. And as was being shared by Dr. Cohen, that some of that is literally when you've experienced trauma, how your brain functions can shift, can alter, that you tend to operate more impulsively, that you don't use quite the same, level of forethought of, if I do this thing, then this consequence will happen. And so if a police officer or any person, it can be any teacher's response, is to then escalate the situation, to yell, to become, violent and use restraints or those things, that's going to create a new trauma. And you can see where it starts to become this looping process, right? And so I think this can happen to any student. Is important to recognize that this is something that happens to many, many children, unfortunately. But to this question's point, we know that various things can increase people's risk, right? And so when we think about increased risk, it means it might not happen to you. It could happen to someone else that doesn't have those risk factors, but it is more likely that these kids have experienced these things. And therefore, we need to be really thoughtful about how we're sort of creating support systems for them within our schools.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, we are at time, and like, you have all had such great questions, and I'm sorry we're not able to get to more of them, but we are at time. So I want to just wrap up by telling you about an initiative that's happening here in Pennsylvania, in our Pennsylvania state system, with Senator Art Haywood. This is another way to get involved and really think through and be an activist around efforts to decriminalize and improve the racial climate for students of color, in particular at our universities in the state system. So please connect with Senator Haywood's initiative if this is something that's interesting to you and that you want to think about how to improve the situation in higher education for students in our system. Next slide. We want to, of course, invite you to our next panel, which is next week. Policing, Data, Tech, and Race, the Next Frontier. Same bat time, same bat place. Okay, so you'll register, you'll get a new link to join, and we really hope that you engage this conversation on predictive policing and surveillance technologies and how they impact Black and Brown communities in particular. Here's the panel for the full series, upcoming sessions, and so mark your calendars and please continue to join us for those conversations. Once again, I want to thank our three panelists for this evening. So informative, so compelling, and really, I think, just a great launch to the sessions and getting us thinking about the impact of policing in all kinds of parts of our society and how we can improve that situation. For the students who are with us who might need an attendance voucher, I'm going to turn this over to Maisha.
All right, so for all who may need an attendance voucher, the link has been dropped right over in the chat. You may click the link and it should be ready to print. You fill in your name and submit it to your instructor.
Okay, so thank you all. Can I see the panel of faces once again? I just want to kind of jump there. Thank you all so much for being here and participating in our first town hall. If something here caught your attention and you want to learn more, by all means, stay connected. Drop us an email, connect with us on social media. We will also have a resource list for those who are looking very quickly and trying to jot down things. We'll post that to our website. so that anyone who wants to take a look at that can. And the recording of this session will also be available on our website for those of you who want to revisit something. Thank you all and have a great evening.